The unseen barrier. The glass doors of Sterling Heights Bank slid open with a soft hiss, letting in a gust of cool, conditioned air that carried the faint scent of fresh coffee and polished leather. It was a place of quiet wealth, where deals were made in whispers and power walked through the halls in tailored suits. Elijah Carter stepped inside, adjusting the cuffs of his charcoal gray blazer. He wasn't new to this world. He had spent years proving himself in it. Boardrooms, negotiations, and late nights spent building his company from the ground up had given him the kind of confidence that came naturally now. But today, standing in the lobby of one of the most prestigious banks in the city, something felt different. His meeting was set for 10:30 a.m. sharp. No reason to expect anything but professionalism. The lobby was an exquisite balance of modern design and old-money sophistication. Mahogany desks, sleek glass partitions, and gold-accented fixtures created a space that spoke of stability and exclusivity. A place designed to impress and intimidate. Elijah approached the reception desk, where a young woman with a neatly pinned bun sat behind a polished marble counter. Her nameplate read Charlotte Reynolds. She barely looked up when he arrived. "Welcome to Sterling Heights Bank," she said, her voice crisp but disinterested. "Do you have an appointment?" "Elijah Carter," he replied, setting his leather portfolio on the counter. "I have a meeting with Daniel Whitmore at 10:30. Charlotte glanced at her screen, tapping the keyboard with a casual indifference. A flicker of something. Recognition, hesitation, something else, crossed her face before she masked it with practiced neutrality. "You're on the schedule," she said, her tone devoid of warmth. "You can have a seat. He'll be with you soon." Elijah nodded, stepping back toward the seating area. He chose a chair near the floor-to-ceiling windows, letting the sunlight cast crisp shadows across his shoes. 10:20 a.m. He was early. He always was. A group of sharply dressed professionals stood by the coffee station, discussing market shifts and investment strategies. Their laughter was light, effortless, the kind shared among people who belonged here. Elijah's fingers drummed lightly against his briefcase. 10:30 a.m. Nothing. A man in a navy blue suit approached the reception desk. Mid-40s, confident stride. "Good morning, Miss Reynolds," he said, flashing a smooth smile. "Mr. Lancaster." Charlotte responded immediately, her voice noticeably softer. "You're here for your 10:45. "That's right. Go right in." Elijah straightened. 10:35 a.m. Another client, a woman in a cream-colored blouse, no appointment from what he could tell, walked in and exchanged pleasantries with Charlotte. Within moments, she, too, was ushered inside. 10:45 a.m. Elijah's fingers tightened around his briefcase handle. His name remained uncalled. A younger man in a gray blazer checked in at the desk. Barely 5 minutes later, a banker appeared and escorted him through the frosted glass doors that led to the executive suites. Still nothing for him. At first, he let it go. Banks ran on tight schedules, but they weren't immune to delays. Yet, as the minutes stretched into nearly half an hour, the pattern became clear. They weren't just behind. They were bypassing him. He exhaled slowly, keeping his expression unreadable. He had dealt with this kind of thing before. The subtle, unspoken barriers that people could always deny later. "Oh, sorry about that. We must have mixed up the schedules. We didn't mean to keep you waiting. Just a busy morning." Nothing personal. It was always personal. He stood, approaching the desk again, his voice calm but firm. "Excuse me, Miss Reynolds," he said. "Has Daniel Whitmore been made aware that I'm waiting?" Charlotte barely looked up from her screen. "He's finishing up a meeting." Elijah waited for a follow-up, some assurance that she would check again, maybe offer an updated time frame. Instead, she simply went back to typing. 10:55 a.m. "Do you have an estimate on when he'll be available?" Elijah asked, careful to keep the frustration out of his voice. Charlotte shrugged. "It shouldn't be much longer." There it was. That word. Soon. A delay without a deadline. A brush-off disguised as reassurance. Before he could respond, movement caught his eye. A woman in a designer pantsuit breezed into the lobby, her phone pressed to her ear. She didn't pause at the desk. She didn't have to. Charlotte's posture immediately shifted. Her expression lightened, her lips curved into something resembling an actual smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Kingsley," she said, her tone suddenly polished. "Morning, Charlotte," the woman said offhandedly, not even breaking stride. Within seconds, a banker appeared at her side, guiding her into the executive wing. No waiting, no questions, no being told soon. Elijah let out a slow breath, rolling his shoulders. He had been here for over half an hour. She had been here for less than 30 seconds. He turned back to Charlotte. "So do appointments matter here, or is it just first come, first served?" For the first time, she looked uncomfortable. "I told you, sir. He'll be with you soon." There it was again. Soon. Elijah exhaled sharply, stepping back. He could let it go. He could sit down and wait another 15, 20, maybe 30 minutes. Pretend this wasn't happening. But this wasn't about a delay. It was about something else entirely. He forced himself to stay calm. He had faced worse. Investors who doubted him, executives who underestimated him, competitors who dismissed him. He had built his empire in spite of all of them. But this wasn't about business. This was about being ignored, being dismissed, being treated as if his time, his presence, his business wasn't worth the same consideration as everyone else's. He checked his watch. 11:05 a.m. An hour. He clenched his jaw, standing decisively. If they wouldn't acknowledge him, he would force them to. Without another word, he strode past the reception desk. "Sir," Charlotte started, but he didn't stop. The frosted glass doors loomed ahead, the gate to the world he was being kept from. The hallway beyond was lined with offices, some doors open, others closed. And at the very end, sitting at his desk, not in a meeting, not busy, but casually typing on his laptop, was Daniel Whitmore. Elijah stepped forward. Whitmore looked up, his expression shifting from surprise to irritation. "Mr. Carter," he said sharply, "you should have waited to be called." Elijah met his gaze evenly. "I did wait." Silence. The air in the room shifted, and Elijah knew in that moment. This conversation wasn't going to go the way Whitmore expected. Not today. The power shift. The silence between Elijah Carter and Daniel Whitmore stretched just long enough to be uncomfortable. Whitmore, a man in his early 50s, with salt and pepper hair and a suit that likely cost more than some cars, was the type who thrived on quiet authority. His office was a testament to that. Minimalist but expensive. A leather chair that practically swallowed him, bookshelves lined with business titles that were more for show than actual reading, and a single framed photograph on the desk, Whitmore shaking hands with a senator. The kind of man who expected people to wait. And Elijah had waited. For over an hour. He didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't act like this was anything but what it was, a blatant dismissal of his time, his value. "I did wait," Elijah repeated, his tone calm but edged with steel. Whitmore's fingers twitched over the papers on his desk, as if debating whether to acknowledge what had just happened or brush it off. He chose the latter. "Have a seat," he said, waving toward the chair opposite him. Elijah sat, not because he was told to, but because he chose to. Whitmore leaned back, adjusting his cuffs. "Now let's discuss your request. I reviewed your file this morning, and I have some concerns." Elijah waited, not reacting, not giving him the satisfaction of frustration. "Your company, Carter Holdings, has had an impressive trajectory over the last 5 years," Whitmore continued, flipping through the pages in front of him. "Your revenue has nearly doubled, your partnerships are solid, and your expansion into tech investments was a smart move." None of this was news to Elijah. "But," Whitmore added, tapping a finger against the folder, "your request for an $8 million business line of credit is ambitious." Elijah didn't blink. Ambitious. Sterling Heights has a strict lending policy, Whitmore said smoothly. We need assurances, more collateral, a higher liquidity ratio. We're not just approving loans based on past success. Elijah folded his hands together. And how exactly does that apply to the 6 other people I saw walk in after me and get taken care of in under 5 minutes? Whitmore's gaze flickered. I'm sorry. I watched at least 6 individuals walk through these doors and be escorted in almost immediately. No waiting, no questions, and something tells me they weren't required to justify their liquidity ratios. A pause. A measured pause. Whitmore's lips pressed into a thin line. I don't control scheduling logistics, Mr. Carter. If there was a delay, I apologize, but let's not make assumptions. Oh, I don't need to assume. Elijah reached into his briefcase and pulled out a printed copy of the bank's recent approvals. Whitmore's face barely twitched, but Elijah caught it. I know for a fact that Sterling Heights approved a $9 million line of credit last month for Bennett and Carlisle Investments. I also know their assets are nearly identical to mine, with one key difference: they've been in business 2 years less than Carter Holdings. Whitmore opened his mouth, but Elijah wasn't done. I also know that Kingsley Enterprises secured a $7 million loan just last week, with a higher debt-to-equity ratio than my company. So if this is about strict lending policies, explain why they qualified without issue. The room was dead silent. Whitmore's jaw ticked. Mr. Carter, we evaluate each applicant individually. It's not as simple as... It's exactly that simple, Elijah interrupted, his voice even, controlled. Let's cut through the red tape. My business is stronger than theirs. My numbers are better. My assets are more than enough collateral. He leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with Whitmore. So tell me, what exactly makes my application more ambitious than theirs? Another beat of silence. Whitmore's fingers tightened around the papers in front of him. He wasn't used to being challenged like this. Look, Elijah, he said, adopting a tone that was supposed to sound reasonable, even friendly. There are factors outside of just financials. Reputation, stability, relationship history with the bank. Elijah let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. Ah, so it's not about numbers. It's about familiarity. Who you know, who you're comfortable with. Whitmore's face remained neutral, but Elijah could see it now. The discomfort, the way he was suddenly aware that every word had consequences. Because the moment Elijah walked out of this office, this story would spread. I'm sorry, Mr. Carter, but at this time, we're unable to approve your request under the current terms, Whitmore said stiffly, sliding the folder back toward him. Elijah didn't move. He could feel the weight of the moment. He could walk out now, take his business elsewhere. But that's exactly what they expected him to do. To accept the decision, to leave quietly, to let this go. No, not today. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and tapped once. Whitmore frowned. What are you doing? Elijah didn't answer. The call rang once, twice. Then a voice picked up. Richard, Elijah said smoothly, leaning back. How's New York treating you? Whitmore's face changed instantly. The voice on the other end laughed. Elijah, didn't expect to hear from you this morning. What's going on? Just sitting in a meeting with your team here at Sterling Heights, Elijah said, watching Whitmore carefully. Running into a little roadblock. Thought you might want to weigh in. There was a brief pause. Then Richard Langston, CEO of Sterling Heights Parent Company, spoke. I don't like the sound of that. What kind of roadblock? Elijah smiled. Just some confusion about loan approvals. You know how it is. Some clients get fast-tracked. Others wait an hour and a half. Another pause. Then Richard's voice turned sharp. Who are you speaking with? Elijah met Whitmore's eyes. Daniel Whitmore. Whitmore's throat bobbed. Richard's tone turned ice-cold. Put him on the phone. Now. Elijah slid the phone across the desk. Whitmore hesitated, then picked it up. Richard, I. Not a word, Richard snapped. You sit there and listen. Then you fix whatever the hell just happened before this turns into a PR nightmare. Whitmore's face paled. Elijah didn't need to hear the rest of the conversation. He already knew how this would end. The tides turn. Whitmore's knuckles whitened around the phone as he listened to the CEO's sharp, clipped voice. He was a man used to control, used to having the final say in every decision made within these walls. But right now, he was silent. Elijah sat back in his chair, watching him with the patience of a man who had played this game before. Every bank, every institution, every so-called gatekeeper of wealth and power had their unspoken rules, and Elijah had learned long ago that the only way to break them was to force their hand. Whitmore finally cleared his throat, nodding stiffly as if Richard Langston, his boss, the actual authority in this room, could see him through the phone. Understood, Whitmore said through clenched teeth. I'll take care of it immediately. Another sharp command from the other end, and then Whitmore slowly lowered the phone, placing it back on the desk like it might explode in his hand. For the first time since Elijah had stepped into this office, Whitmore looked uncertain. Elijah didn't move, didn't speak. He just waited. Because now, for the first time in this entire meeting, the pressure wasn't on him. Whitmore inhaled deeply, straightening his tie, as if trying to salvage some dignity, but they both knew the dynamic in the room had shifted permanently. Mr. Carter, Whitmore began, his voice forcibly even. It appears there's been a misunderstanding regarding your application. A misunderstanding. Elijah almost laughed. That was always the excuse, wasn't it? A polite, professional way of saying, we didn't think you were worth our time, but now we have no choice. Whitmore reached for the folder he had so confidently pushed back across the desk just moments ago. This time, he pulled it toward him. I've taken another look at your financials, he continued, his tone shifting, the condescension replaced with forced respect. It's clear that Carter Holdings is a solid investment for our institution. I believe we can approve your request under the terms originally proposed. Elijah tilted his head slightly. Interesting, he mused, because just a few minutes ago, you called my request ambitious. Now, suddenly, it's a solid investment. Whitmore's jaw clenched. There were factors that needed to be reconsidered. Right, Elijah said, nodding. Factors that somehow didn't apply to the others who walked in before me. Got it. Silence. Whitmore knew he had no defense. The only reason this conversation had flipped in Elijah's favor was because of the man on the other end of that phone. And that was the real issue here. Because even though he was getting what he came for, Elijah knew that the only reason Whitmore was backpedaling was because he had been forced to. If Richard Langston hadn't intervened, if Elijah hadn't had the connections, the influence, the ability to call out the system in real time, he would have been dismissed. Again. Just like countless others had been before him. Just like countless others still would be. Elijah drummed his fingers against the armrest of the chair. Tell me something, Mr. Whitmore, he said casually. How many others do you think walked through this door with strong applications but never got past that reception desk? Whitmore's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. You really think you're the first person to do this? Elijah continued, voice low and calm. To push past the doors you weren't supposed to demand the same level of respect that others get by default. Whitmore didn't answer, because they both knew the truth. Elijah leaned forward slightly, his voice steady. The only difference between me and them, he said, I had the right number in my phone. Silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Whitmore swallowed. I can assure you. Don't, Elijah interrupted smoothly. Don't assure me. Don't offer some neatly packaged PR response about how this was an unfortunate mistake. He let the weight of his words sink in before adding, just process the damn paperwork. Whitmore's lips pressed into a thin line. Without another word, he flipped open the file and began approving the loan. Elijah watched him sign each page, initial every line, his movements stiff and reluctant. When the last signature was in place, Whitmore set the pen down. "Your loan is approved," he said, his voice tightly controlled. "You'll receive the official confirmation within the next 2 hours." Elijah picked up the folder and slid it into his briefcase. "Good," he said. He stood, adjusting his blazer. "Now, about your receptionist." Whitmore looked up sharply. "What about her?" Elijah smiled, a cold, knowing smile. "I'll assume she'll be having a long conversation with HR today." Whitmore's shoulders tensed. "I don't." "Because if she isn't." Elijah's gaze was sharp. "Then Richard will be hearing from me again." The unspoken threat hung between them. It wasn't about getting someone fired. It was about accountability. Because for people like Whitmore, for institutions like Sterling Heights, the real punishment wasn't lawsuits or public scandal. It was scrutiny. It was forcing them to recognize the cracks in their carefully built walls. Whitmore exhaled slowly. "Consider it handled." Elijah nodded, glad to hear it. He turned and walked to the door. When he stepped back into the lobby, Charlotte Reynolds, the receptionist who had so easily dismissed him, stiffened. She knew. She knew. Elijah didn't stop, didn't acknowledge the nervous glance she shot toward Whitmore's office. Instead, he strode past her, through the pristine lobby, and out the glass doors into the heat of the city. As he stepped onto the sidewalk, his phone vibrated. A new email. Subject: Loan approved. He smirked. Because today, he didn't just win. He forced them to lose. And the next time someone like him walked through those doors, Whitmore would remember this moment. Because this wasn't just about a loan. This was about power. And today, Elijah Carter had taken it back. The ripple effect. Elijah stepped onto the sidewalk, feeling the heat of the late morning sun pressing against his skin. The world outside the walls of Sterling Heights Bank continued as if nothing had happened, people hurrying to their jobs, taxis honking, life moving forward. But inside those pristine glass doors, a shift had occurred. He had won. But the battle wasn't just about this one meeting, this one moment. It was about everything that came after. He tucked his phone into his pocket and strode toward his car. He had barely reached the curb before his phone vibrated again. Another email. Subject: Your meeting at Sterling Heights Bank. A follow-up. He exhaled, already knowing who it was from before even opening it. Whitmore. The message was short, strategic. Mr. Carter, we appreciate your patience today and are grateful for the opportunity to continue building a strong relationship with Carter Holdings. If there is anything else you need, please don't hesitate to reach out. No mention of the hour-and-a-half wait. No mention of the systematic bias that led to him being sidelined. Just corporate politeness, wrapped in the illusion of professionalism. Elijah smirked, shaking his head. They were already in damage control mode. Good. Because this wasn't just about making them uncomfortable today. It was about ensuring they felt the consequences tomorrow. Back at Carter Holdings. By the time Elijah pulled into the underground garage of his headquarters, his assistant, Naomi, was already waiting at the private elevator. She was a woman of precision, sharp, efficient, unshakable. If something was on her face, it wasn't worry. It was anticipation. "You heard," Elijah said as the elevator doors closed. "Of course I heard," Naomi replied, tapping on her tablet. News travels fast when you make the CEO of a major bank sweat in his own office. Elijah smirked. "I don't know what you're talking about." She raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. "You've got 3 missed calls from Marcus Langford," she continued, swiping through her screen. "Richard Langston's son. He runs their corporate investment division. Wants a meeting." Elijah leaned against the elevator wall, considering. Marcus. The next in line for the empire. The one who was smart enough to see the writing on the wall before his father had to clean up Whitmore's mess. "Call him back," Elijah said. "Set a lunch for Friday. Somewhere public." Naomi tapped the screen. You want him sweating too. I want him knowing that next time this happens, there won't be a phone call to save them. A meeting they didn't expect. 2 hours later, Elijah sat in his conference room, watching a group of his senior advisors go through their own numbers. Expansion plans, future investments. His company was already moving forward. But that didn't mean Sterling Heights Bank was off the hook. Naomi knocked once before stepping inside. "Marcus Langford on the line for you," she said, placing his phone on the table. Elijah took a slow breath and pressed the button to answer. "Marcus," he greeted, his tone effortlessly smooth. "You've been trying to reach me." A pause. Then, a voice that wasn't used to being ignored. "Elijah," Marcus said, his words carefully measured. "I heard about the meeting this morning. Unfortunate. Shouldn't have happened." Elijah leaned back in his chair, yet it did. Marcus exhaled. "Look, I won't waste your time with corporate excuses. What do you need to make this right?" That was the difference between Marcus and Whitmore. Marcus wasn't pretending. He knew this story couldn't spread. He knew Elijah's name carried weight. Elijah let the question hang in the air for a moment, letting Marcus sit in the discomfort of not knowing what was coming next. Then finally, Elijah spoke. "You're going to offer Carter Holdings priority client status. Effective immediately." Silence. Then, "Doan, you're going to review your lending policies and send me a detailed report about how approvals are actually handled. I expect to see it in my inbox by Monday." Another pause. "That's going to take some time." Elijah smiled. "That's funny. Didn't seem to take time when you were handing out loans to other clients this month." Marcus sighed, but Elijah knew he wouldn't argue. "Fine," Marcus conceded. "What else?" Elijah's voice turned serious. "Your bank has a problem, Marcus, and I don't just mean Whitmore." Marcus hesitated. "We're handling it." "No," Elijah said. "You're reacting to it. There's a difference." Marcus said nothing. Elijah leaned forward, his voice quieter now, more dangerous. "You think I'm the only one who's been through this." Silence. "You think this is just one mistake, just one unfortunate experience." More silence. "I'll make this simple, Marcus," Elijah continued, his voice cold. "You're either the guy who fixes the problem, or the guy who waits until it explodes." The message was clear. If Marcus didn't clean up the mess from the inside, Elijah wouldn't be the last person to talk about it. And next time, it wouldn't be a private conversation. Marcus sighed again. But this time, it wasn't frustration. It was resignation. "We'll talk Friday," Marcus finally said. "Lunch, you pick the place." Elijah smirked. "See you then." He ended the call, sliding the phone back toward Naomi. She watched him carefully. "So," Elijah exhaled, standing. "They'll play nice. For now." Naomi studied him. And after that, Elijah buttoned his blazer, stepping toward the window. "After that," he murmured, staring out at the city skyline, "they either change or they burn." The turning point. Elijah ended the call, but he didn't move right away. The weight of the moment settled over him. He had played the game well, forced their hand, secured what he came for. But the bigger question remained. Would this actually change anything? Sterling Heights had folded under pressure this time. But what about the others who came after him? The ones without a direct line to power. The ones who would sit in that lobby for an hour and a half and walk away with nothing. His jaw tightened. No, this wasn't enough. "Naomi," he said, turning back to his assistant. She lifted her eyes from the tablet, already anticipating what was coming next. "You want me to draft a statement?" Elijah gave her a knowing look. "You think I'm gonna let this stay behind closed doors?" A slow smirk curved her lips. "I hoped not." Elijah took a breath, thinking. He couldn't just call it out. If he did, Sterling Heights would just bury the problem. They'd put out a carefully worded statement, fire a couple of mid-level employees, and pretend it was never systemic. That wasn't good enough. He needed leverage, something bigger than just his story, something that forced them to fix this, not just for him, but for everyone after him. He met Naomi's gaze. Pull the numbers. I want data on every major bank's approval rate based on demographics, size of business, and first-time loan applicants. Naomi's brows lifted slightly. You want proof of bias. I want to build a case. Elijah folded his arms. We're not just making this about me. We're making it about all of them. Naomi's smirk widened, but there was respect in her eyes. You're not just playing the game, she murmured. You're rewriting it. Elijah shrugged. Someone has to. The system exposed. 2 days later, Naomi strode into his office with a folder thick enough to change history. She dropped it onto his desk. You're gonna love this. Elijah picked up the top sheet, scanning the numbers. His eyes narrowed. Approval rates, loan amounts, demographics. The pattern was undeniable. Companies owned by certain types of individuals, the ones who looked like Whitmore's favorite clients, had an approval rate nearly 30% higher than others, despite equal financial strength. The numbers told the truth that banks would never say out loud. Elijah let out a slow breath, a satisfied gleam in his eyes. This, he said, tapping the page, is leverage. Naomi sat across from him, her expression sharp. So what's the move? Leak it to the press. Call an investor meeting. Drag them into a PR nightmare. Elijah shook his head. Not yet. If we go public now, they'll scramble, deny everything, and shut the doors before we can push them through. Naomi frowned. Then what? Elijah leaned forward, his voice calm, calculated. We make them come to us. The trap is set. The next morning, Sterling Heights Bank called him first. Marcus Langford's voice was smoother this time, more careful. Elijah, he greeted. Hope you're having a productive week. Elijah smirked at the polite nonsense. What can I do for you, Marcus? A short pause. Then, I'd like to propose a meeting. Not just with me, but with our broader executive team. We'd like to discuss ways to improve transparency and strengthen relationships with clients like Carter Holdings. There it was. They weren't just looking to fix their mistake with Elijah. They were scared, and fear meant leverage. Elijah played it cool. I'll check my schedule. What did you have in mind? We can come to you, Marcus offered quickly. Our office, your office, wherever you prefer. Elijah nearly laughed. A week ago, they'd made him wait an hour and a half for a meeting. Now, they were willing to come to him. My office, Elijah decided. Friday morning. And Marcus? Yes. Bring your policy team. Another pause. Then, understood. Checkmate. The face of change. Friday morning came faster than expected. Elijah sat at the head of the long conference table, watching as Sterling Heights' entire leadership team entered his office. Whitmore was there, but his usual arrogance had faded into strained politeness. Marcus was leading the conversation, flanked by a group of senior executives. They looked like they had prepared for war, but they had already lost. Elijah let them speak first. Let them talk about partnerships and equity in lending. Let them attempt to control the narrative. Then he slid the folder across the table. The data, the evidence, the proof. Whitmore went pale. Marcus exhaled sharply. I assume this means you're expecting change. Elijah clasped his hands together. No, Marcus. I expect policy reform. I expect written commitments. And I expect an announcement, not just internally, but publicly, on the steps your bank will be taking. Silence. They weren't used to being dictated terms. Too bad. This, Elijah continued, tapping the folder, is what happens when you underestimate the wrong people. Whitmore finally spoke, his voice tense. And if we refuse? Elijah's smile didn't waver. Then next week, every major publication in the country gets a copy of this report, along with a very personal account of how your bank operates. A slow breath passed around the room. Then Marcus nodded. "We'll draft the announcement," he said quietly. Elijah leaned back. "Good. The future begins now." By the end of the day, Sterling Heights released a statement. They called it a commitment to fair banking practices. They spoke of revised policies, equal access to funding, and improved transparency. The language was polished, careful, but Elijah knew the truth. They weren't changing because they wanted to. They were changing because he forced them to. And when he walked out of his office that evening, watching the city lights flicker on, he felt something different. Not just victory. Momentum. Because today, it wasn't just about a loan. It was about every person who would walk into a bank tomorrow and never have to wait an hour and a half just to be seen. The legacy of a shifted power. Elijah Carter stood at his office window, staring down at the city below. The skyline was bathed in golden light, the pulse of urban life flowing as it always did. Taxis crawling through the streets, pedestrians weaving between traffic, and businesses humming with late-hour activity. But something was different now. He had forced change, and they knew it. His phone buzzed on his desk, breaking his thoughts. Naomi, as always, had impeccable timing. "News just dropped," she said the moment he answered. "Sterling Heights' public statement is getting traction. Every financial outlet is picking it up." Elijah smirked. "Good. You'll love this." Marcus Langford just went on record calling it a new era of equitable banking practices. Elijah chuckled. "Oh, so now he's a champion of fairness. Funny how quickly they shift when the pressure's on." Naomi's tone was sharp with amusement. Elijah leaned against his desk, stretching his shoulders. "This isn't just a PR stunt for them," he said. "It's survival. They know the walls are closing in, and now they have to play the hero or get left behind. And we're letting them. For now." Elijah's voice was calm but decisive, because the goal was never just to bring them down. It was to make sure this never happens again. Naomi exhaled, her voice softer now. "You think it'll last?" Elijah's jaw tightened. That was the real question, wasn't it? Power didn't change. It adapted. It reshaped itself to fit new circumstances, to disguise itself under new language. Sterling Heights would play nice now, but how long before they tried to rebuild the same barriers with different rules? His gaze drifted to the framed photo on his desk, his father's old construction business, the real Carter Holdings, the company his father had spent decades building. A business that never had the same access, the same resources, the same funding that wealthier, whiter companies did. Elijah had built something bigger, something stronger. But the game had always been rigged against men like his father. And that had to change. A meeting that changed everything. The next morning, Elijah walked into his conference room, where his team was already assembled. Naomi had set up a projector, displaying Sterling Heights' public statement on the screen. "Let's break it down," she said. "They're pledging a complete overhaul of their lending policies. They've also announced an independent oversight committee." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "Who's on the committee?" Naomi smirked. "Exactly. They haven't named anyone yet. Just a promise. A promise without accountability is nothing." Elijah folded his arms. "We're not letting them control the narrative." Naomi nodded. "I figured you'd say that, so I already made a few calls. There's an independent watchdog group that specializes in financial discrimination cases. They're willing to step in as third-party auditors." Elijah smiled. "That's why I keep you around." "Obviously," Naomi said dryly. He turned to the rest of the team. "I want a full media strategy. We're not just reacting to their statement. We're defining the expectations. We set the standard, not them." His head of PR, Jasmine, nodded. "We release our own statement. We commend them for taking the first step, while making it clear that real change requires continuous action. We highlight the historical issues in lending discrimination." Elijah pointed at her. "Exactly. and we make sure this doesn't just fade into the next news cycle." The team nodded, already diving into their notes. But Elijah wasn't done. He turned to Naomi. "Get me a meeting with Senator Grant's office." A murmur went through the room. Naomi's eyebrows lifted. "We're going that big." Elijah's voice was unwavering. Vigor. When a personal fight becomes a national one. 2 weeks later, Elijah walked into the office of Senator Rebecca Grant. She was known for her no-nonsense approach to corporate accountability and had been a vocal advocate for economic fairness. She greeted him with a firm handshake. "Mr. Carter," she said, motioning for him to sit. "I've been following what happened with Sterling Heights. I assume you're not here just to talk about that." Elijah sat across from her, his expression serious. "This isn't about one bank. It's about the entire system." She leaned back, watching him carefully. "Go on." Elijah placed a file on her desk, the same one Naomi had compiled weeks earlier. "These are national lending statistics, broken down by race, income level, and business size. The numbers don't lie." Grant flipped through the pages, her expression darkening. "This isn't just negligence," she murmured. "This is systemic exclusion." Elijah nodded. "I don't just want to fix Sterling Heights. I want legislative reform. I want transparency laws, public reporting on loan approvals, mandatory independent audits for banks above a certain threshold." Grant exhaled, rubbing her temples. "You realize what you're asking for is a war against some of the biggest financial institutions in the country." Elijah met her gaze. "So, I've already won the first battle." A slow smile crossed her lips. "I like you, Carter. You remind me of myself when I first got into politics." She tapped her desk. "I'll take this to committee. But I'll need public backing. Business owners, advocates, people who can tell their stories." Elijah nodded. "I'll get them." She extended her hand. "Then let's make history." The future isn't given. It's taken. A month later, Sterling Heights wasn't the only bank making changes. Other financial institutions were scrambling, proactively announcing new policies before the pressure reached them. The watchdog group had begun auditing lending practices, and Elijah, he wasn't just a businessman anymore. He was the face of a movement, the kind of movement that didn't fade away, the kind that left a mark on history. And as he stood in his office, looking at the city he had once thought was untouchable, he realized something. He wasn't done yet. Because real power didn't wait to be given. It was taken. And he had just begun. The final move. Elijah Carter stood at the podium, a sea of reporters and cameras in front of him. The banner behind him read, "Equal access, economic justice, no more barriers." This wasn't just a press conference. This was the culmination of everything he had fought for. It had been 6 weeks since his meeting at Sterling Heights Bank. 6 weeks since he forced their hand, exposed their bias, and set off a chain reaction in the industry. Now, the world was watching. He adjusted the mic, scanning the faces in the audience. Business owners, community leaders, activists, even politicians. They weren't just here for a statement. They were here because they saw what he had done, and they wanted to be part of it. He let the silence stretch, let the weight of the moment settle over the room. Then he spoke. "I stood in a bank lobby for an hour and a half," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Not because they were busy, not because I didn't have an appointment, but because the people in power didn't think I belonged." A murmur went through the crowd. "We hear a lot of excuses in business," he continued. "It was a mix-up, a misunderstanding. We didn't mean to overlook you. But let's be honest. The system isn't broken. It's working exactly the way it was designed." The murmurs grew louder. Elijah stepped back from the podium, pacing slowly. "For decades, banks have dictated who succeeds and who struggles," he said. "They don't just hold money, they hold opportunity. They decide who gets funded, who gets to build, who gets to grow." His eyes scanned the crowd, landing on a row of small business owners. They told my father that his company wasn't stable enough to get a loan, he said, voice tightening. He worked 16-hour days building homes for this city, but when he needed funding to expand, doors shut in his face. A young woman in the audience nodded. She knew that feeling. My story isn't unique, Elijah continued. It's happening every day to people just like us. And banks. They've been getting away with it because they know we won't fight back. He stopped, turned back toward the crowd. Well, I'm here to tell them that's over. The room erupted in applause. Elijah let it ride for a moment before raising a hand to quiet them. This is bigger than me, bigger than one bank, bigger than one industry, he said. We're here today to demand more. Not just words, not just PR-friendly diversity pledges. We want laws. We want policies. We want banks to be held accountable for the communities they claim to serve. He looked toward the row of government officials sitting at the front. Senator Grant is introducing legislation that will require all major banks to publicly report loan approval rates by race, gender, and income level. A wave of whispers spread through the crowd. This was real. This was systemic. The bill will enforce independent oversight on lending practices. It will demand transparency, prevent discrimination, and create a level playing field for the first time in history. The applause grew deafening. Elijah stepped forward, gripping the edges of the podium. But let me be clear, he said, his voice strong. This won't be easy. They are going to fight back. They are going to claim this is unnecessary regulation. They are going to pour millions into lobbying to kill this bill before it even reaches the floor. He leaned in slightly. So we're going to make them listen. The cameras zoomed in. Every single bank that fails to comply. We name them. We expose them. We hold their feet to the fire until they either fix their practices or we take our business elsewhere. The crowd erupted. This wasn't just a press conference anymore. This was a movement. Elijah stepped back as Senator Rebecca Grant approached the mic. She nodded toward him before addressing the crowd. We're not waiting for corporate goodwill, she said. We're passing the Fair Lending Accountability Act. And I'll say this to the banks that are watching right now. You're either on the right side of history, or you're standing in our way. Thunderous applause shook the room. Elijah glanced at Naomi, who stood at the side, arms crossed, grinning. This is happening, she mouthed. Elijah smiled. Yeah, it was. The fallout. That night, Elijah sat in his office, watching the headlines roll in. New bill proposes radical transparency in banking industry. Elijah Carter challenges the system, and it's working. Corporate leaders scramble to address bias in lending. His phone buzzed. A text from Marcus Langford. Mar-CUS. This is bigger than just one law. You're coming for all of us, aren't you? Elijah smirked. Elijah. Not coming. I'm already here. A pause. Then Marcus responded. Mar-CUS. We should talk. Elijah leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Oh, now he wanted to talk. Good. Because this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. 1 year later, the Fair Lending Accountability Act passed in Congress. Banks were forced to release their lending data. Institutions that had quietly discriminated for years were finally exposed. Sterling Heights Bank. They had no choice but to lead the charge in reform. And Elijah Carter Holdings expanded into banking. He built the kind of financial institution that had never existed before, one that actually served the people who had been denied for too long. Marcus Langford. He left Sterling Heights and joined Elijah. Because in the end, power didn't belong to those who had it the longest. It belonged to those who demanded change. And Elijah Carter, he didn't just demand it. He created it.